Hey, welcome to the Heimler's History Channel. I'm Steve Heimler, and I'm here to get you an A in your class and a 5 on your AP test.
Just kidding! It's not Steve Heimler.
Welcome to the Industrial Revolution podcast.
Featuring Hillary Smith, Anna Baylin, Connor Plumly, Lulu Rosenberg, Louise Perdomo, and Sophia Mokotoff.
Hey, Travis Elliott Day!
The Industrial Revolution was a time of great change throughout the entire world, economically, politically, and socially. Social structures were changed, groups revolted against their kings, and a true global economy emerged for the first time in human history. All of these innovations will be talked about throughout today's podcast.
Throughout the Industrial Revolution, advancements in new industries such as the steel, chemical, and electricity industries led to new possibilities in production. With electricity, workdays lengthened because they didn't have to follow the hours of the sun. Joshua B. Freeman explains how people are coming from rural backgrounds who are used to self-directing their work, which is organized around the seasons and light. And when factory jobs became clock-regulated, it was a massive transition to get used to. The steel industry not only made production easier, but also increased transportation with the development of railroad tracks, specifically through mountains and plains. Chemicals allowed for the creation of new medicines along with pesticides so crops could grow faster and larger yields. Chemicals such as sulfuric acid were used to treat cloths and textiles.
Most advances in communication and transportation during this time can be attributed to the steam engine, a revolutionary innovation that jump-started the economies and interactions of numerous countries. Invented in 1807 by Robert Fulton, the steam engine led the way to inventions such as the railroad. Trade increased with trains because they could carry large amounts of crops. Migration and global interactions were affected as people could ride trains and get to other faraway cities quickly. In fact, LumenLearning.com reads, its average of 20 miles per hour was twice as fast as other available modes of transportation. Because railroads already provided most countries with a network between cities, most telegraph lines were hooked up next to railroads. This allowed people to communicate and interact with those thousands of miles away by using these lines. As described in the textbook, by the late 1840s, telegraph wires crisscrossed the entire United States and Western Europe. It was the beginning of a network that eventually connected the entire globe.
The primary cause for the living and working conditions of the laboring class was rapid industrialization. Strayer Text Chapter 17 states, by 1851, a majority of Britain's population lived in towns and cities, an adjustment from previous rural life. The cities became unsanitary, overcrowded, and smoky. With these factors, periodic epidemics, endless tenements, few public services or open spaces, and inadequate and often polluted water supplies was part of the environment in which most urban workers lived in the first half of the 19th century. The average life expectancy in England was only 39.5 years, which was a dramatic change from centuries prior. Due to the many people working in factories, the laboring class experienced poor working conditions. Long hours, low wages, and child labor was already normalized for the poor, although the cycle of dreariness at work imposed by the factory and its needs of machines caused unpleasant conditions of labor. Children often worked long, tireless hours, in dangerous conditions and for little profit. They were useful as laborers because their small size allowed them to maneuver around in small spaces, in factories or mines where adults couldn't fit. Majorly, children could be used as cheap labor and could be paid less than adults. Child laborers often worked in these unpleasant conditions to help support their families, and in return of this, had to leave their education behind. In reference to a photo taken during this time period named The Little Spinner and Bib Mill, a little girl had to climb onto the spinning frame to mend broken threads. This demonstrates the tough working conditions laboring class children faced in the industry, even in the face of danger.
Throughout the Industrial Revolution, two economic ideologies emerged as the main policies of industrializing countries: socialism and capitalism. Socialism was based off the idea of laissez-faire, and a main component of capitalism was mercantilism. The idea of socialism thrived during the Industrial Revolution, as many of the working class saw it as an equalizer in society. The textbook states, the Industrial Revolution strengthened the ideas of laissez-faire and socialism and sparked workers' protest. They are similar in that they both believe labor is the main source of capital in an economy. They differ in many ways, the biggest being how socialism believes the government should control economic production, while capitalism says that private individuals should. In socialism, there is no private property. Everything is owned by the state. Therefore, everyone works for one pool of money, which is then distributed as the government sees fit. In capitalism, individuals and companies control production, and all the government does is set laws to make sure all companies are acting fairly.
While slower to take in the new technologies of the time, Germany after 1850 became the continent's major producer of coal, iron, and steel. According to the textbook, Germany and France enjoyed industrial booms based on iron, cotton, steam engines, and railroads. And in 1850, Germany already had 3,639 miles of railroad. The German Industrial Revolution also benefited from recipients of close links between industry and the banking sector, which ensured long-term funding. Germany also took advantage of the innovations of the time, like the division of labor and mass production.
In an issue written by Dana Parvanova of the College of the DuPage, she made a point that industrialization was the driving force behind imperialism, as it created the need for Europe to expand and gave Europe the power to profitably maintain many colonies around the world.
The German government interfered in the economy, giving tax incentives to those that they thought had growth potential. The government also structured the industry to have an emphasis on superior education, combining academic studies and on-the-job training.
Railroads were built and trailed throughout rural areas. In Asia and Africa, the Great Transformation reached, for the first time, into areas remote from port cities. Due to the telegraph, orders could be wired and received over great distances in a short amount of time. These were just the broad subjects of how industrialization impacted imperialism. Because the Industrial Revolution increased the production capacity of Western states largely, raw materials were on the hunt. Thus, the Western powers sought colonies where raw materials were abundant and where they could be allowed to use cheap labor. This brought to the attention on Africa, India, and China, which were all rich in raw materials and could be used for cheap labor. Without the innovations of the Industrial Revolution, the imperialistic powers would not be able to spread into the colonial countries. Their access would be limited to the ports. Now, with steam-powered trains and ships, people and goods can move faster and cheaper than ever before.
One of the major reactions to industrialization was women's suffrage. Before the Industrial Revolution, women mainly worked in traditional jobs such as raising children and making clothes, and they lived on small farms in rural areas. During the Industrial Revolution, people began being forced off of their farms and into urban areas seeking jobs. Women were pushed into the workforce as well as men into textile factories and coal mines. However, they were not valued as much as men as they were paid much less and subject to awful conditions. In protest of the inequality, a new movement took form in order to encourage the government to give women the right to vote, called women's suffrage. Finally, in 1920, women's suffrage became the 19th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution. Another major reaction to industrialization was change in public education. Before the 1800s, education was not free and poor children rarely got proper education and mostly only received some from Sunday school. Soon, changes to the harsh policies began during the Industrial Revolution, such as the Factory Act of 1833. In this act, the British government required 2 hours of education mandatory for those children working in factories. In 1870, state-funded board schools for education were set up, and in 1902, a system of secondary schools were established. Some historians believe that these reforms were made because of the unrest caused by a lack of education and support for children, and others speculate it happened because the government wanted to educate people to make more money for the country. Lastly, labor movements were another huge result of industrialization. The AP textbook states, from the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, workers resisted the introduction of new technologies. Workers were not only upset by harsh working conditions, but also by the mechanization of their jobs. They went on strike, destroyed machines that threatened their livelihoods, and gradually organized groups to demand certain rights such as men's suffrage and shorter workdays. These movements were eventually successful in persuading the parliament to investigate conditions and initiate reforms.
The AP textbook best summarizes the Industrial Revolution with the description of the most profound transformation in human life since the beginnings of agriculture. This quote perfectly emulates the lasting impacts that industrialization has had on our societies since the 18th century. Thank you so much for listening.